Iran had spent years engineering an air defense network designed to make the Persian Gulf a graveyard for American air power. The USS Abraham Lincoln had spent years preparing to prove that network was not enough. On the night Tehran's commanders chose to test that preparation, they received an answer that no intelligence assessment had predicted, and no wargame had survived contact with. The radar contact appeared at 2:14 local time. One track, then a second, then a third, emerging from the noise at the edge of the scope with the unmistakable trajectory signature of weapons already in flight. By the time the watch officer's hand reached his headset, the USS Abraham Lincoln's Combat Information Center had already resolved the picture. Iranian, inbound, multiple vectors. The countdown began without ceremony. 120 seconds to estimated intercept range. 90 seconds. The Aegis system was already building firing solutions across 3 simultaneous threat tracks, allocating interceptors, computing geometries at speeds no human decision cycle could match. 60 seconds. Every weapons station reported ready. 30. The Persian Gulf had been silent for hours. The silence was gone. What happened in the seconds that followed would not only determine the survival of the strike group, it would begin a chain of events that ended with Tehran's defenses reduced to wreckage across a nation that had believed, until that moment, that it was protected. But the launch itself wasn't what shocked the analysts in the hours that followed. What shocked them was the scale of the miscalculation that had produced it. The USS Abraham Lincoln had not arrived on station in the Persian Gulf without deliberate intent and months of preparation behind it. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had been operating across the Red Sea and through the Strait of Hormuz for weeks, a deployment that threaded the most contested maritime corridor in the world with a formation carrying more strike capability than most national air forces could assemble in a month. Her mission was layered. Presence was the visible component. The strike group's position told every adversary in the region that the United States maintained freedom of navigation and freedom of action in these waters as a matter of standing policy, not negotiated permission. But beneath the presence mission was something more precise. Intelligence had been accumulating. Targeting packages had been built. The Lincoln's air wing, its F/A-18 Super Hornets loaded with precision weapons, its electronic attack aircraft configured for deep penetration missions, had been exercising strike profiles against a specific set of target coordinates for weeks before any weapon was fired. The strike group's escort formation, guided missile destroyers and cruisers networked through the Aegis combat system into a single unified defensive and offensive organism, had completed its pre-combat calibrations. Every ship knew its role. Every crew had rehearsed its response. The Abraham Lincoln wasn't waiting in the Persian Gulf. She was ready in the Persian Gulf. But Iran launched anyway. And that single decision would cost Tehran everything it had built. The Iranian attack reportedly originated from multiple fixed and mobile launch positions activated simultaneously, a deliberate architecture designed to force the strike group's defensive systems to engage competing threat types from different vectors in the same compressed time window. From fixed ballistic missile sites came high-trajectory rounds descending at terminal velocity on steep arcs designed to complicate the intercept geometry of surface-based systems. From coastal positions came anti-ship cruise missiles hugging the wavetop altitude that radar systems find most difficult to acquire against the sea clutter of the Persian Gulf surface. And into the electromagnetic environment around the strike group's formation came a drone swarm, reportedly configured to function simultaneously as decoys, as electronic noise generators, and as terminal guidance platforms for the kinetic weapons closing behind them. The attack architecture reflected years of study. Iran had reportedly analyzed American carrier defense doctrine with the intensity of an institution that understood its survival depended on finding the gaps in a system designed to have none. The targeting was oriented at the Lincoln herself. At 2:14, fire commands were executed across every launch site simultaneously. Weapons were in the air, and the crew of the Abraham Lincoln had 120 seconds. What happened inside that combat information center in the seconds that followed has the quality of events that only become fully visible in retrospect, when the recorded data, the voice logs, and the sensor tracks are assembled into a picture of controlled speed that borders on the superhuman. The Aegis combat system does not wait for human authorization to begin building firing solutions. The thermal bloom of a ballistic missile launch is detectable by space-based sensors within seconds of ignition, data that flows directly into the strike group's shared tactical network before the weapon has climbed above its launch site. By the time the Iranian missiles had been airborne for 15 seconds, the Abraham Lincoln CIC had correlated every track, classified every threat type, and allocated interceptor assets to each engagement simultaneously. The ballistic component was high and fast. The cruise missiles were low and close, flying nap of the Earth profiles specifically chosen to force interlayer engagement. The drone swarm was diffuse, distributed, and operating in the frequency ranges that EW systems had to prioritize to prevent terminal guidance lockup on the kinetic weapons. The CIC watch team worked the picture with a composure that spoke to nothing but relentless preparation. No elevated voices. No wasted words. Firing solutions confirmed. Intercept corridors established. The countdown ticked through 90 seconds. Through 60. Through the final threshold where decisions stop being decisions and become executions. But that wasn't the real test for the strike group. The real test was what happened when every defensive layer fired simultaneously in a live engagement for the first time. The Aegis architecture is not a weapons platform in isolation. It is a networked battle management system that makes every ship in a strike group a node in a single, integrated kill chain. SM-6 interceptors, capable of engaging ballistic threats in their terminal descent phase at extreme range, climbed from the destroyer's vertical launch cells with the compressed thunder of a controlled explosion and arced into the dark above the Persian Gulf on intercept vectors that had been computed to within meters of accuracy. The evolved Sea Sparrow missile handled the cruise missile tracks in the inner defensive zone faster, more maneuverable, designed for precisely the kind of low-altitude, high-speed closing geometry that the Iranian weapons presented. CIWS mounts rotated to their engagement sectors and stood ready as the final line, the last wall of tungsten between any surviving threat and the Abraham Lincoln's hull. Electronic warfare suites aboard multiple escorts transmitted simultaneously across the frequencies the drone swarm needed to maintain coherence, jamming, spoofing, degrading the swarm's ability to function as a coordinated targeting system at the moment it needed to perform. The electromagnetic environment around the strike group had become a weapon in itself. And above the formation, in the dark over the Gulf, the SM-6 rounds were running down their targets with the cold precision of systems that do not miss when the solution is right. On this night, the solution was right. The impact flashes came in rapid succession. 1, 2, 3 detonations in the upper air, points of white light expanding and fading above the Persian Gulf that marked the end of Iranian ballistic missiles that had been in flight for less than 90 seconds. Clean intercepts. High-altitude fragmentation. Wreckage falling wide of the formation. The ESSM engagements against the cruise missile tracks were closer and faster, the interceptors closing at combined speeds that left almost no reaction interval before the proximity fuses triggered. Detonations close enough to the water that the concussion was audible aboard the nearest escort. The drone swarm lost coherence under the electronic warfare envelope before it could deliver its terminal guidance function, fragmenting into individual uncoordinated units that the CIWS picked apart at close range in a sequence that lasted seconds. Then silence. The Persian Gulf surface returned to black water and scattered debris. Not a single weapon had reached the Abraham Lincoln. Every track had been prosecuted. Every intercept had been executed. The strike group had absorbed a multi-vector Iranian attack built on years of doctrine development and returned nothing but falling metal. Then this happened. And it was not what Tehran's war planners had modeled when they calculated what a failed attack would produce. The assumption, embedded in Iranian strategic doctrine at the foundational level, was that even a failed strike against a U.S. Navy carrier would generate enough international hesitation, enough escalation anxiety, enough diplomatic noise to forestall a direct American military response. Tehran had reportedly calculated that the United States would intercept, would absorb, and would pause. That in the pause, Iran would have made its statement, that carriers were targetable, that the threshold had been crossed, and that Tehran had demonstrated resolve without absorbing consequences. The pause never came. Within hours of the final intercept, the Navy strike began. Not a warning. Not a calibrated signal. A systematic, sequenced, precisely targeted dismantlement of every radar installation, every command and control node, every surface-to-air missile battery, and every integrated fire control facility that the Abraham Lincoln's intelligence architecture had spent weeks identifying and ranging. Tehran's defenses didn't absorb damage that night. They collapsed, site by site, layer by layer, node by node. By the time the sun rose over the Persian Gulf, what Iran had built to protect itself from exactly this kind of strike was gone, and the visibility from orbit confirmed it. But what almost happened, what the Iranian attack was designed to achieve, and how close the margins actually were, demands to be stated without softening. A carrier strike group is not merely a weapons platform. It is the physical embodiment of American power projection, a symbol whose loss or degradation would have constituted the most consequential naval combat event in a generation. Had a single SM-6 missed its terminal intercept window, a ballistic warhead at terminal velocity carries the kinetic and explosive energy to catastrophically damage a carrier flight deck. A single cruise missile reaching detonation range against the island structure, the command nerve center of the entire air wing, would have degraded the strike group's ability to coordinate its own defense at the precise moment that coordination was most critical. The Abraham Lincoln carries thousands of sailors. Her air wing represents irreplaceable national capability. Her loss, even her incapacitation, would have redrawn the strategic map of the Persian Gulf overnight. The Navy strike that followed was not a punitive reflex. It was the calibrated execution of a plan designed to ensure that the system which had generated this attack could not survive long enough to regenerate and attempt it again. And that leads directly to the question no analyst in Tehran wants to answer. Why does the collapse of Tehran's defenses after the Navy strike matter beyond the immediate operational picture? Because what fell that night was not simply hardware. It was the infrastructure of a deterrence theory. Iran's air defense network had been constructed, dispersed, hardened, and exercised specifically to impose cost and risk on American strike operations over or near Iranian territory. The theory was that the network's depth, its layered redundancy, its dispersal across multiple geographic positions, its integration of overlapping engagement zones, would make it survivable against anything short of a nuclear exchange. The Navy strike reportedly sequenced its targeting to dismantle that theory at its foundations. Early warning radars went first, blinding the system before it could coordinate a response to what followed. Command nodes went next, severing the communications architecture that gave individual batteries their targeting data and their authorization to fire. Isolated from the network, surviving surface-to-air sites reportedly degraded to autonomous local modes that stripped them of the integrated engagement capability that made them dangerous. What Tehran had constructed after decades of investment, what Iran had protected and exercised and hardened and believed would hold, collapsed not because the weapons used against it were overwhelming in number. It collapsed because the targeting was perfect. And perfect targeting is the product of intelligence gathered over months, of planning conducted with the patience and precision that only a navy with generations of strike experience can bring to bear. Because when that experience is applied against a target set it has studied completely, the result is not a battle. It is a verdict. Modern air defense rests on a principle that no amount of hardware spending can overcome if the adversary understands the architecture well enough. A layered system is only as resilient as the integrity of the communications that hold its layers together. Remove the communications. Blind the radars. Sever the authorization chain. And what remains is a collection of isolated weapon systems operating without situational awareness, without coordinated targeting data, and without the network coherence that transforms individual batteries into a unified defensive shield. The USS Abraham Lincoln and her strike group demonstrated, in a single operational night, across the confined and contested waters of the Persian Gulf, that American naval power retains the capacity to find those communications, to plan their removal in precise sequence, and to execute that plan under combat conditions against an adversary that had devoted years to preventing exactly this outcome. What Iran lost after the Navy strike was not recoverable in weeks or months. The defenses that had collapsed were not simply destroyed. They were exposed, their architecture understood, their vulnerabilities catalogued, their operational logic reversed and used against them. The Abraham Lincoln sent a message that will be studied in every institution that takes carrier strike warfare seriously. In the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, and in every capital where planners sit around targeting maps and ask whether American carriers remain the most consequential offensive instruments on Earth. The answer came on that night. It came without ambiguity, and it will not require repetition.